Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Tuesday, March 11th, day 522 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman, joining me from the Jerusalem office. Hi, Lazar. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
Always a pleasure having you. All sides negotiating the hostage release/ceasefire deal are assembling in Doha. And today we're going to try and drill into what is actually happening currently and try to understand what actually did just happen in terms of the U.S.'s widely publicized direct negotiations with the terrorist organization Hamas. We'll learn more about Adam Boehler, who is U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy for hostages, and he is the one who conducted these direct negotiations. Were they a one-off? Was this a multiple occasion? We're going to hear more. And finally, we'll turn to the Trump administration and again ask a question that we began pondering several episodes ago, which was, should Israel be wary of a quick turn in the president's affections for its greatest ally in the Middle East? So, Lazar, let's start with trying to unravel what is happening right now in Doha in terms of the ceasefire negotiations. It appears to me that all sides are now assembled. So can you confirm who is currently there?
Yep. There is an Israeli team. It's fairly senior, but it's not the highest level. So you have Gal Hirsch, who's the government's hostage point man. He is someone who is very close to the families, a former general. Alongside him is M, who is a senior Shin Bet official. You will remember, and we've talked about this, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar are not in a place where they have the best relation right now. Netanyahu seems to be trying to push Ronen Bar out. Bar has said that he would only step down after the hostages are all freed and after there's a state commission of inquiry into October 7th and everything around it. So Ronen Bar, who was one of the two leaders of these hostage talks delegations, is now basically out of the picture. And you have another senior Shin Bet official who's quite experienced and confident, but we can only call him M or Mev in Hebrew. And also you have Netanyahu's diplomatic advisor, Ophir Falk, also someone who's quite competent and knowledgeable. But you will notice that Ron Dermer, who's really Netanyahu's top aide in terms of how he interacts with the world and especially on important things like the war and the hostage talks, he is not there. And I think that means that they're not about to make any drastic moves or drastic decisions right now. Also there you have the U.S., you have Steve Witkoff, who is the U.S. Special Middle East envoy, someone who is quite close to Trump and has been at many of these negotiations. And it's happening in Doha, so you have Qatar's prime minister there, and those officials. Egypt is there, and of course there are Hamas officials there who will not be speaking directly to Israel, and hopefully not with the U.S. either this time.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in a bit. I'm a little not confused, but surprised perhaps that Witkoff is there and Dermer is not. Do you think that is essentially a message that Netanyahu is sending about the talks? Because wouldn't Witkoff be about the same level on the chessboard as Dermer?
Yeah, that's a good point. Witkoff is kind of the senior official who's directly involved with these talks. Under Biden, it was the head of the CIA. So Bill Burns, but yeah, it looks like Witkoff is going to be leading the talks from here on out. But I think the reason that Netanyahu didn't send Dermer is because, not to say signal to America or anything like that, but he wants to make sure that it's clear that no one's moving to the second phase right now, that there still needs to be a lot to be worked out. And what Israel is pushing for is a basically continuation of phase one, let's call it phase 1.5, where there are more significant hostage releases of living hostages. There's up to 24 still there, and he doesn't have to declare any sort of end to the war or anything dramatic like that.
Okay, so that leads us to what people are calling Witkoff's outline for, I guess, what you're calling phase 1.5. And that seems to be essentially a 60-day ceasefire, and in return, Israel would get back 10 living hostages, including the final American-Israeli living hostage. So how feasible do you think this plan is?
Just want to say something that maybe I should have said outright. Right now, the ceasefire is officially over, right? Phase one is done. We haven't moved to anything else. Israel has given 11 days of ceasefire to Hamas for nothing, right? It cut off the electricity, quote unquote, to that one plant in the Gaza Strip, the desalination plant. But right now, Israel is giving Hamas what it wants, which is a total lack of any offensive military operations besides for occasional drone strikes, and it's not getting anything back. It's not getting any sort of concession. It's not getting any hostages taken up. Now, in terms of the Witkoff plan, Israel said that they are adopting it. It seems to have been created by Witkoff and Dermer together last week. Is it feasible? Sure. It is feasible if Hamas understands that they're not going to get what they want right now, which is a full move toward phase two, which means the end of the war, and I would say their victory. That the best they can do right now is to try to play for time, release 10 living hostages, which is a big percentage. It could be half of what they have left, and retain 10 more, or the rest of them. It could be up to 14 more for the end of that 60-day period. 60 days is a long ceasefire period, but it's maybe less problematic for Israel since it doesn't seem like we're moving toward going back to war anyway. So I think this is what Netanyahu's preferred outcome would be. He doesn't like to take decisions before he has to. It would preserve his ability to tell the right wing of his coalition, I haven't finished the war. We're going to go back to war at some point, even though we'll be stretching into the summer by then. But at the same time, he'll continue to be getting hostages out. So I think that's what Israel wants. Question is where Hamas thinks that it can do better now. I think Hamas certainly feels that there's some wind in its sails. It finally got something I think it wouldn't have dreamed of in the past, which is direct talks with the United States without having to give anything up. And it understands that maybe they could see some cracks that they can exploit between Netanyahu and Trump.
Okay, we're going to go to a short break and then talk about these direct negotiations between the United States and the terrorist organization Hamas. And we're back. So when news broke about a week ago about these direct talks between the United States and Hamas, it was very surprising, I think, to most media and perhaps most people of the world. And slowly, we're beginning to have more of a picture in terms of how these came about. And the U.S. envoy in charge of hostages, Adam Boehler, has given a series of interviews in which he kind of defended himself and kind of explained more what happened behind the scenes. And it appears to me that he just basically dropped by and started talking with Hamas, who served him coffee, and they had a bit of a chat. And it's possible it happened one time. It's possible it happened multiple times. It's a very cloudy picture. So, Lazar, what do you actually know about the tachlis, the very practical information of these direct negotiations with Hamas?
So, yeah, you're right that Boehler and his series of interviews, I think, made things even less clear than if he hadn't come on at all. What we know is they had at least one meeting in Doha beginning of last week. We know that the Israelis were extremely upset. We know that there was a very tense call between Ron Dermer and Boehler. We don't know if they're going to happen again because Boehler himself said it could happen. He said very blithely, oh yeah, I might just drop by again. But then you had Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying on the plane quite clearly that that was a one-off, and that was it. Now, did he have the blessing of Donald Trump to do that? It's not quite sure because it's not quite clear because Boehler said initially in one of the interviews that Trump himself signed off on it, but then when he was pressed by Channel 12, by Yonid Levy, he said it was the White House. So it seems to be, we've been reporting that it was Witkoff who ultimately signed off on it. So Boehler himself has contradicted himself and said another number of problematic things in that series of interviews. But what it seems is that he and some people around him saw an opportunity. Let's not forget that Trump likes to deliver, and the people around him want to deliver for Trump. So they are not necessarily held back by traditional rules of diplomacy or restrictions. Trump himself, walked a step into North Korea to talk to the North Korean dictator. So they're open to talk to people. They think that just direct human contact can lead to some good things. And it seems to be that that's what Boehler was doing. Now, if Boehler was a more experienced, I would say a more serious negotiator, even though I'm sure he's trying to do what he can, but he doesn't have a lot of experience in this field, it might be less problematic. But when you have someone who doesn't come from this field, and I think if you watch the interviews, you get a sense of where he stands and his capabilities, and that's the one who's going up against these very serious, very experienced, and very ruthless Hamas negotiators. I think that's another problem there as well.
So the interview that I watched in full was one that Boehler himself posted to his Twitter or X feed, and that was on Fox News. And Fox is, of course, a pretty sympathetic platform to the Trump administration. And even there, I could see that the journalist, she did a very good job of trying to pull out the details. And in other interviews, such as on CNN, it's really astounding to me how much Boehler is basically humanizing Hamas. And that's something that you just said, that the Trump administration is very pro having human-to-human contact. But at the same time, Hamas is, of course, a designated terrorist organization. The U.S. designated Hamas thusly in, I think, 1997. So I just find it really baffling that he's able to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and just shoot the breeze with these people as if they were equal partners in any kind of negotiation. But maybe that's just my Israeli prejudice speaking here.
No, I think people were shocked, not only in Israel, but also Americans. And, it's a terrible precedent. And again, there's other people in the administration you'd be more comfortable with doing that. It would be better if they had spoken with the Israelis ahead of time and kind of set expectations. But it doesn't seem like it was that. I think a question, Amanda, that we need to ask is when Boehler was saying some kind of outlandish things during his interviews, was this Trump speaking through him? So when he says, the kind of the gratuitous comment that Israel is not an agent of, America is not an agent of Israel, which ties into some kind of, far-right anti-Semitic conspiracies that America is quote-unquote occupied territory too because they march to Israel's drums, and all sorts of those conspiracy theories you'll see on X. Was that just Boehler being kind of sloppy with his words, or was Trump sending a message through Boehler? And I think most people I speak to actually think that he was coming with a message, which is quite worrying. But then throughout, there was all sorts of things that he said wrong. Edan Alexander that you brought up. So there's one living American hostage left, and he got his name wrong twice. He called him Adi Alexander, who's Edan's father. You would think he would get that right. Something else that was very worrying, he kept calling Israeli hostages prisoners. So a lot of these are civilians who were taken, from homes, from a party. He calls them prisoners. And Palestinian prisoners, some of whom are hardened terrorists and mass murderers who are serving life sentences, he calls them hostages. Did that a couple of times. So if this is the person, then I think we need someone who can speak much more precisely and clearly. And then you have to think, what was he saying in those conversations with Hamas? Was he speaking as sloppily in negotiations where everything is very, very fraught and you have to be very careful about what you say? So I think there's a lot of questions now. I know that the Israeli side spoke to the White House afterward, asked for clarifications, and I think this is the first. This is actually a surprising little piece of, not even so small, but a piece of tension, an area where there's some stress and some tension between the two. I thought this would come primarily over the Iran nuclear talks, but we also see that that could also be a source of tension in the near future as well.
What do we know about Boehler? In some of his interviews, he was talking about being a part of the Trump milieu, at least being in the Oval Office or in the West Wing in the previous term that Trump served as president. So who is he? It's the first time we're really hearing of him.
Yeah, so he wasn't so senior. I mean, I think his way into the White House was he was a college roommate of Jared Kushner, who was obviously a very dominant figure of the previous administration. And I have to say, quite a competent one as well. He took on a lot of things, and ultimately he played a key role in what happened in the Middle East and the Abraham Accords. I think no one would say that he was really in over his head, though there were doubts about him at the beginning because he came from a business, not a diplomatic background, but I think he handled himself well. Boehler was part of the COVID-19 response with Kushner. So that gave him, the initial step into the White House. But here he's been given a much broader role. There were some successes that he's had. They were able to bring some hostages back, not only from Gaza, but American hostages, prisoners, whatever you want to call it, from Russia. He has had some notches on his belt, but the way those interviews went and the fact that no one was saying, all right, let's cut off these interviews, but they kept doing more and more interviews. And then he had to do a tweet late at night where he cited one of our articles and tried to clarify what he was saying about Hamas humanity, I think shows an element of inexperience and also perhaps unseriousness or lack of seriousness. Our chief editor, David, had a very pointed piece. I think it's still up on our main page. I had a Twitter thread that also gained a lot of attention in terms of pointing out what happened during those interviews. I think people were very shocked to hear some of what was said.
Look, you and I both know from doing our podcast, The Daily Briefing, so often that it is at times really difficult to speak coherently when you're tired, when you've been working extremely long hours. But at the same time, it's the casualness with which he says, for example, when he was asked if he would continue these direct talks with the terrorist organization Hamas, he says, you never know. Sometimes you're in the area and you drop by. So that is indeed very baffling. I'm sure we'll be talking about this saga a lot more in the future. So in the meantime, I want to close with speaking about a piece that you have recently published, which basically asks the question, will Israel continue to be a favored son, as we are right now, a real friend, a real ally to the Trump administration? Or is it possible that on the turn of a dime, the Trump administration will decide that we are no longer an ally that they need to keep in their pockets? So we all know, and we've discussed several times, that Israel would not have been able to fight this war against Hamas without the U.S. So the question is, I guess, basically, how much is Israel going to suck it up if the Trump administration does begin to start belittling our leadership, such as what happened with Zelensky, or what is happening here? Is there any indication that our friendship could fray so easily?
So there's a few reasons why people would be asking this question. I think one of them is the fact that you had 4 years of very positive and productive relationship between Netanyahu and Donald Trump from 2016 to 2020. And then in 2021, there was that famous interview with Barak Ravid, where he turns on Netanyahu, says he's disloyal because he called President Biden to congratulate him, and then says F him, on an on-record interview. So you see how we can flip. The other things that worry people is that traditional American allies have come under pressure from Trump. So whether it's Canada, that tariff war and kind of musings about turning them into the 51st state, Colombia, which is a very close American security ally, and there was that brief incident where there was a threat of 25% to 50% tariffs because they wouldn't take illegal immigrants back on a flight. And other traditional allies, Jordan, right, totally surprised by Trump singling them out as someone who's going to take in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Gazans. And then, of course, the famous Zelensky White House disastrous interview a couple of Fridays ago, not an interview, basically a press conference, a press availability at the Oval Office, where Zelensky, again, Ukraine is, kind of the Western cause right now, where America has led the effort under Biden to provide aid and to provide diplomatic support after the 2022 Russian invasion. And then you have a conversation which is supposed to be around signing this minerals deal, descend into a very rare on-camera fight between J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and Zelensky, where they're just berating him. And then you have to say, if they're willing to do that, what does that mean for Israel? Now, I know Ukraine and Israel are very different in the way the White House sees them. I think Trump doesn't understand what the real American interest is here in the alliance with Ukraine. It's a lot of money. It's billions and billions of dollars. You can fight over how much, but let's say somewhere around $180, $200 billion of American money that's gone into a war that Ukraine's not going to win. There's a risk of a nuclear war. And it's not like America gets a ton from Ukraine in terms of its own interests. So there's certainly an argument to be made that this is not an overwhelming American interest. Even though they are a democratic, broadly liberal society and are certainly oriented toward the West. With Israel, it's very different. Trump understands what the interest is here. There are common enemies. The enemies of Israel are also the enemies of the U.S. You're talking about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, of course, all backed by Iran, which is America's major enemy in the region. That's not going to change. And, of course, Israel gives America a ton in terms of its standing in the region, military technology, joint operations, other types of technology. It's a very staunch and capable ally, and not one that is a massive money suck like Ukraine is. Again, it's a few $1 billion a year, but a lot of that goes back into the American economy, and there's plenty of Israeli investment back in the U.S. So it's a very different situation. And you look at the people that Trump has brought into his administration, people like Rubio and Mike Waltz and Mike Huckabee when he comes to Jerusalem. These are people that believe deeply in the relationship. So it's not the same situation at all. But again, like I said, there are areas where it could turn into a small crack, which gets bigger. It looks like Trump wants to talk to Iran about the nuclear deal. It looks like he's somewhat open to having Russia mediate that. That's not something that Israel wants. And on the hostage talks, there's also potential for a problem. And then could Trump push Israel to move toward a Palestinian state because he wants that Saudi deal? He wants the Nobel Prize. It could happen as well. So we all have to keep an eye on those things moving forward.
I think one of the most important things that you mentioned kind of as a throwaway is that a lot of the aid that Israel does receive from the U.S. actually does make its way back into the U.S. economy. And that is something that a lot of people overlook. I think in all of these discussions of giving aid to Israel versus giving aid to Ukraine, something that perhaps hasn't been emphasized enough. But yeah, I mean, we all know that the president of the United States is a very dynamic figure, and one never knows, and perhaps he doesn't even himself know what is going to be the stance in the next day or even the next hour. So it is, of course, something that Israel is very wary of, I would assume. But is there even any possibility that Israel could go it alone without the United States in prosecuting a further armed conflict against Hamas?
Against Hamas, absolutely. It'll be harder, but Israel has its own domestic capability, and there's no shortage of countries that they can buy from. If you're talking about over time, yeah, I mean, having Israel on your side in the Middle East means that whatever country is aiding Israel, is acting as, let's say, their military sponsor, all of a sudden has a dominant role in the Middle East. If you're allied with the dominant military power, then anything that happens there, you can influence. So let's say, theoretically, if America just walked away, I think you would have Russia and China be very eager to enhance their relationship with Israel and gain a foothold there as well. So it's not like Israel is lacking for options. There are also opportunities with the Europeans. The Europeans are arming now. They understand they can't rely on the U.S. As they did in the past to defend Europe. They need to enhance their capabilities very quickly. And if they want a partner that knows how to make advanced technology, that can produce and sell a lot of the things that they need and also trade together with them. They'll have Israel there as well. If Israel's wise enough to take advantage of this, they'll see that their options are only growing. That doesn't mean you have to turn away from the U.S. Obviously, ideally, you work with the U.S. The ties are so wide and so deep that that's the natural partner, and Netanyahu understands this entirely.
Lazar, I could talk with you much longer, and in fact, we will speak again for our Friday focus this week, which falls on Purim. And so, do you want to give a hint of what we're going to talk about now?
Well, since the Purim story deals with ancient Persia, we will talk about a little bit about ancient Persia, but also the modern successor, modern Iran, at times a friend of Israel, and currently Israel's bitter enemy.
Great. I really look forward to this conversation. So listeners, check us out on Friday for the Friday Focus. Lazar, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.